They told Sergeant Thomas Reed it would be just another deployment, 6 months in and out, nothing more than a routine rotation to a place most Marines had barely heard of. Okinawa, a small humid island tucked away in the East China Sea. The kind of assignment that didn't make headlines or require combat gear to be constantly strapped to your chest. Enjoy the beaches, they said. Try the ramen. But the moment Reed stepped off that transport plane, he felt something tighten in the air, like the island was breathing just beneath the surface, holding its breath. Camp Schwab, his new duty station, was perched on a seemingly peaceful stretch of land surrounded by tropical foliage, ocean breeze, and the hum of cicadas. But underneath it all, there was a weight, not the kind that came from the heat or the heavy packs Marines wore on patrol. This weight was quieter, more intimate. It pressed down at night when the laughter in the smoke pit died down and the barracks grew still. Reed, a 62-year-old combat veteran with silver in his beard and sand still stuck in the creases of his boots from past deployments, had seen war. He'd held dying men in his arms. He had memorized the sound of artillery, but nothing prepared him for what he would feel in that place. At first it came as whispers, strange stories traded in passing, never too seriously. A shadow moving through the vehicle bay after lights out. The cold spot near the stairwell that made grown men shiver. The voice of a child echoing in the hallway long after taps had sounded. Just oaky weirdness, the younger guys called it, brushing off what they couldn't explain. But Reed paid attention. He always had. Years of combat had sharpened his sense for danger, even if it wore no uniform. One night he found himself alone in the maintenance lot checking inventory while the rest of the crew was on liberty. That's when he saw her. A small girl, no more than 8 years old, standing barefoot on the edge of the chain-link fence. Her hair was soaked with rain, her dress clinging to her arms. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She only stared. Reed called out to her, instinct not logic, but the girl turned, passed directly through the fence, and vanished into the trees. No sound, no footprints, just gone. He didn't mention it right away, not because he doubted himself, but because he wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe someone's kid got loose. Maybe he was just tired. But the next day, a lance corporal approached him in private and asked if he had seen the girl. No description, no prompting, just the question, raw and unfiltered. That's when Reed knew it wasn't just him. There were others, many others. Men who wouldn't speak openly for fear of ridicule, but who carried the same haunted look in their eyes. These weren't conspiracy theorists or ghost hunters. These were Marines, disciplined, trained, rational men sharing a truth they could not reconcile with the rules of the physical world. The more Reed dug into the island's history, the more the pieces began to fit. During World War II, Okinawa had been the site of one of the bloodiest battles the United States ever fought. Nearly 300,000 lives lost in just a few short weeks. Men, women, and children, many of them civilians slaughtered in the crossfire, driven to suicide or used as pawns by a collapsing regime. The ground beneath Camp Schwab wasn't just soil, it was soaked in sorrow. 1,000 tragedies never spoken aloud, each one echoing beneath the surface of that tropical paradise. The girl, he later learned, was believed to be one of many spirits said to linger on the base of her life, cut short by a military vehicle decades ago. Her story passed down in whispers through generations of Marines who had seen her just like Reed. What began as an ordinary deployment transformed into something far more spiritual, far more unsettling. Reed began to feel as though he wasn't stationed at Camp Schwab, was stationed with something else, something older than war, something broken and restless. At night he would sit at his desk and write letters home, but his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. The silence wasn't comforting, it pulsed, and every now and then the faint sound of feet small, wet, hesitant, echoed down the corridor. Reed had faced enemy fire-buried brothers and carried the weight of survival on his shoulders, but it was on that quiet island in peacetime that he truly understood what it meant to be haunted. Years later, long-retired Reed still dreams of Okinawa. Not the beaches, not the barracks, but the face of a little girl who never said a word and yet spoke volumes. He tells her story now, not for fame, not for fear, but because some truths refuse to stay buried. And maybe acknowledging them is the first step toward peace, both for the living and for the lost. They say some places never forget, Not the blood, not the screams, not the silence that follows when the last shot is fired. Okinawa is one of those places. It doesn't just hold history, it inhales it. And if you're still long enough, it breathes it back out. For Sergeant Thomas Reed, it started on a rain-slick night just before midnight. But the story doesn't begin there. It begins decades earlier with a child whose name has been lost to time, the girl on the ramp. No one remembers what she was doing there, or why a child would have wandered into a military lot after dark. The story that survives, passed from one generation of Marines to the next like some twisted rite of passage, says she was struck by a transport truck in the late 1970s. Some say it was an accident. Others say she had no business being near the vehicles. But everyone agrees on one thing: since that day she's never left. You see, Camp Schwab may be fenced, regulated, guarded, but it sits on borrowed ground. Ground that once screamed beneath the weight of 300,000 deaths during the Battle of Okinawa. That kind of agony doesn't fade. It anchors itself. And in some cases, it walks. Reed hadn't heard the story at first. He was too busy acclimating, figuring out chow schedules, rotation duty, dealing with humidity that seemed to melt the flesh off your bones. He'd been in country only a few weeks when he was assigned a late-night check of the vehicle lot, what the guys called the ramp. Rows of AAVs and lavs slept in the dark like dormant beasts. The air was wet, the kind that seeps into your boots and never quite dries. Reed had his flashlight, his checklist, and the solitude of an island most people only pretend to understand. That's when he saw her. 30 feet ahead, standing motionless between the last line of tracked vehicles and the cyclone fence, was a girl no older than 10. Barefoot, drenched, her face unreadable, eyes fixed like searchlights into his soul. Reed froze. He called out, not like a Marine, but like a father. "You okay?" No answer. She tilted her head slightly. Then, without breaking eye contact, she turned and walked, not around the fence, but through it, into the jungle mist beyond. By the time Reed could form a thought that wasn't pure adrenaline, she was gone. No rustling bushes, no footprints in the puddles, no indication she'd ever been there. He didn't file a report, not because he was afraid of the paperwork, but because deep down he knew the others wouldn't be surprised. And he was right. When he mentioned it casually to a mechanic over breakfast the next morning, the man didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just nodded and said, "You saw the girl." From that moment forward, Reed started hearing the stories everywhere, never formally, never during briefings, but in hushed conversations in the smoke pit, whispered exchanges during midnight firewatch. Some Marines had seen her standing in the rain. Others caught a glimpse of her reflected in glass, but when they turned around, no one was there. One lance corporal claimed she had appeared at the foot of his bunk and whispered in Japanese before vanishing. Another swore she'd run past him in the motor pool, and he could still hear her laughter. But what unified all the stories wasn't just the girl, it was the reaction. None of these men were prone to fantasy. They didn't scare easy. But when they spoke of her, their voices dropped, their faces tightened, and their eyes looked haunted, as if seeing her wasn't just witnessing a ghost, it was becoming part of something the living were never meant to touch. Reed, ever the pragmatist, tried to reason it out. Maybe the stories created a kind of mass hysteria. Maybe too many deployments had frayed their nerves. Maybe. But then came the incident in the barracks. It happened 2 weeks after the sighting. Reed was doing laundry in the third-floor washroom, something no Marine enjoys, especially in Okinawa, where broken dryers and sticky heat turn every laundry run into an ordeal. He loaded his clothes, stepped out for 5 minutes, came back, and every dryer door was wide open. He knew he'd close them. He always did. This was military life. You didn't cut corners, not even with detergent. He checked the hallway. No one. No footsteps. Nothing. He shut the doors again. This time he stayed, and that's when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, a small white blur. Movement. Fast but unmistakable. He spun around the empty room, but the air had shifted. There was static like the tension before a lightning strike. Then he felt it: fingers. Cold, small fingers brushing the back of his shaved head. He dropped to his knees, heart slamming against his ribcage. And when he stood, there was no one there. Again. It was no longer just the ramp, it was everywhere. Others began sharing their own experiences. Doors slamming shut, radios turning on without batteries. shadowy figures peeking from behind lockers. One Marine swore he heard the soft sound of someone humming a Japanese lullaby outside his window at 2 a.m. He was on the third floor. Another reported a girl's voice calling his name while he was on duty watch. When he turned to look, he saw a child's handprint, wet muddy on the inside of the locked glass door. The legends kept coming. Some claimed the girl was just one of many spirits on Schwab. A few Marines mentioned a woman older in a white kimono who wandered near the barracks at night, her eyes hollow, her movements dreamlike. But the girl remained the center of it all. And as Reed would come to realize, she wasn't simply a haunting, she was a memory, a tether, a human echo that refused to fade. She was the island's protest, its way of saying, "You built your base on our bones. We are still here." The Battle of Okinawa wasn't a footnote. It was a mass trauma. Nearly 150,000 civilians died, many by suicide. Some were pushed, some jumped. Entire families vanished off cliffs, fed falsehoods by their own commanders that the Americans would torture them. Mothers given grenades to kill their children, then themselves. And when the war ended, when the treaties were signed and the bases were built, the ground itself did not forget. Camp Schwab stands atop mass graves. Maybe not literal ones, but psychic ones. The ghosts aren't malicious. They're grieving, lost, and perhaps in some way they're reaching out not to scare the living, but to be remembered by them. Reed never tried to debunk it again. The rational side of him still wanted answers. But the spiritual side, the side that woke up every night with goosebumps and silence ringing in his ears, knew better. When he finally rotated back to the States, he did so quietly. No send-off party, no grand farewells. Just a single final walk along the fence line one rainy evening. He paused where she'd once stood. No sign of her, just the jungle heavy with memory. He whispered, "I saw you." Whether she heard, hell never know. But some truths don't need to be confirmed. They just need to be told. They say combat builds a kind of steel inside you, that once you've faced enemy fire-buried brothers in the dust and marched beneath skies filled with mortars, fear becomes a memory you can manage. But what no drill instructor warns you about is the fear that doesn't bleed. The kind that whispers, waits, and watches. The kind that makes war-hardened men disciplined, logical, trained to shoot and not flinch, freeze like children in the dark. That's what made the stories from Camp Schwab so impossible to ignore. They weren't told by wide-eyed privates seeking attention. They came from sergeant staff, NCOs, and officers with multiple combat toursmen with service ribbons older than most recruits. Men like Gunnery Sergeant Victor Navarro, a 20-year Marine with 2 Purple Hearts, whose voice cracked the day he told his story. It was the barracks, always the barracks. For Navarro, it started one night after lights out. He was reviewing field reports alone in the common room when he heard boots on the tile light, quick, almost playful. He assumed it was a junior Marine sneaking in past curfew. But when he turned the corner, the hallway was empty. Not just empty still, the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. Then came the second sound, a soft tapping, like fingers on a locker. Not random, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. He followed the noise, heart rate, steady, mind sharp. He was a combat vet after all. He'd cleared buildings in Fallujah. But as he rounded the final corner, every hair on his arm stood on end. Because what he saw wasn't a Marine. It was a figure small, crouched at the far end of the corridor, illuminated only by the red glow of the emergency exit sign. It didn't move. It didn't flinch. And then, without warning, it melted into the wall. Navarro didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he didn't file a report. But during chow, he told a corporal at his table what he'd seen. The corporal went quiet, dropped his fork, and simply said, "You saw her too." The more you listened, the more the testimonies surfaced. Some were brief, quick sightings, unexplained noises, the sound of children giggling behind locked doors. Others were longer, more detailed, more chilling. One Marine claimed he was shaving in the mirror when he saw a pale child's face appear directly behind his shoulder. He spun around, nothing. But the mirror stayed fogged and the tiny handprint didn't fade. A military police sergeant reported seeing someone standing perfectly still on the shooting range at night, motionless, barefoot, in civilian clothes. When he approached, the figure vanished. Radios stopped working. Flashlights dimmed. The air turned icy despite the Okinawan humidity. He never returned to that post alone again. And then there were the dreams. Marines began describing near-identical nightmares being pulled beneath their racks by unseen forces, waking up to see someone sitting silently at the foot of their bed. One even claimed he dreamt of walking through a tunnel filled with screaming children in tattered wartime clothing, faces he didn't recognize but couldn't forget. Another dreamt of a woman staring into his soul and whispering in perfect English, "You took my son." When he woke, his nose was bleeding, and his bunkmate had the same dream verbatim. What separated these stories from campfire tales or ghost lore was the consistency. Different ranks, different platoons, different years, but the same recurring images, the same feelings of dread, the same moments of silence that seemed louder than combat. They didn't report it officially. No one filed incident forms or wrote memos to higher command. Because how do you explain that something touched your soul in a place where no one should be? But the stories persisted, passed in whispers, huddled in corners, shared between men who had no other explanation. One of the most disturbing testimonies came from a seasoned EOD tech named Paul McAllister. He was working a routine equipment calibration inside an old armory building when the lights flickered. At first, he assumed it was faulty wiring. It wouldn't be the first time. But then the temperature dropped, not gradually, suddenly, as if someone had sucked the heat from the room. He turned toward the door and saw what he described as a mass of shadows, not human-shaped but moving, breathing, and then just as fast as it appeared, it was gone. But something stayed. Mac didn't talk about it until months later, after he began waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night. Not 332, not 334, always 333. Wide awake, heart pounding, a strange metallic taste in his mouth, and the growing creeping feeling that someone was sitting on his chest. Sleep paralysis? Maybe. But Mac wasn't a man prone to suggestion. He'd spent a career defusing bombs. He didn't scare easy. But whatever was happening, he knew one thing: it followed him home. Even after he rotated back stateside, the waking continued. He finally moved into a new apartment, began sleeping better, and almost forgot until the night he dropped his keys walking through his front door and found a single white footprint on the hardwood floor. Small, barefoot, like a child had walked through flour. He sold the place 2 days later. These weren't the only ones. There was Staff Sergeant Ellis, who refused to ever return to the weapons vault alone after hearing his name whispered through the vents 3 separate times. Lieutenant Harper, who once found every door in his hallway propped open at the exact same angle, despite no one being there. And Corporal Jameson, who walked into the latrine one morning and saw an entire mirror fogged up with the words, "I see you," traced by a finger that hadn't left prints. None of these men ever met the others. Their ranks, units, and years of service varied, but their testimonies overlapped, too often too precisely. Something was happening, and the more you listened, the more impossible it became to dismiss it all as coincidence. The spirits didn't always appear. They didn't always touch, but they lingered. They watched. They reminded the living that they weren't alone on that land. Not truly. One of the most respected voices to speak out was a retired Colonel Arthur Kane, now in his 70s. He had served at Camp Schwab in the 1980s. During an interview for a veteran's oral history project, he paused mid-recording, leaned into the microphone and said, "We talk about ghosts like there's something that belongs in stories, but I'll tell you this: I've seen what grief looks like when it refuses to die. I've seen what a place becomes when it's soaked in suffering." Schwab wasn't haunted by monsters. It was haunted by memory. His voice cracked. His hands trembled slightly. "I still remember the feeling, like I was always being watched, but not by something evil, by something forgotten, something no one had the decency to bury properly." So what do you do with that kind of truth? You can dismiss it as folklore. You can laugh, shrug, or chalk it up to the stress of deployment. But deep down, every Marine who served there remembers. Not because they were afraid, but because they weren't supposed to feel that kind of fear. What these men experienced wasn't fantasy. It was remembrance of a war that ended on paper but never ended in the soil, of souls that never left, of voices that refused silence, and above all else, of a single shared truth whispered among hardened men who never believed in ghosts until they met one. These weren't just stories. They were warnings, testimonies, And if we're wise, well, listen. Before there were bunk beds and motor pools, before concrete foundations and military salutes echoed across the jungle canopy, Okinawa was a place of blood and fire. A quiet island drenched in the Pacific breeze transformed overnight into a slaughterhouse for empire. And long after the treaties were signed and the flags were folded, the screams never truly stopped. Not for the land, not for the dead, and not for those who came decades later, thinking they were just here to serve. But the island remembered. It always did. By the time Sergeant Thomas Reed began to piece together the unexplained events he and his fellow Marines had witnessed, footsteps, voices, apparitions, the girl by the Ramfee also started digging deeper. Not into ghost stories, but into history. Real history. The kind that doesn't get covered in official briefings or glossy documentaries. The kind buried beneath silence and shame. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 was the deadliest conflict of the entire Pacific theater. It was meant to be the final push before invading mainland Japan, but it became something else, a tragedy of unthinkable scale. Nearly 300,000 people died on that island. Of them, at least 150,000 were civilian, fathers, mothers, grandparents, and children. These weren't combatants. These were farmers, fishermen, school teachers, infants. And how they died is what haunts the ground. There are stories, well-documented, verified. Japanese civilians being told by their own military leaders that surrendering to the Americans meant torture, rape, or slavery. Entire villages were ordered to flee inland. Women were handed grenades. Yes, grenades. With instructions to kill their children first, then themselves. Some refused and were executed as traitors. Others believed the lies and jumped from cliffs, their screams swallowed by the ocean. Whole families vanished in minutes. Mothers clutching babies leapt into ravines. Grandparents walked into gunfire with prayer beads in hand. Some dug holes to hide and were buried alive when those holes collapsed. By the time U.S. forces finally secured the island, the ground was soaked in blood. The trauma didn't just scar the survivors, it soaked into the rock, into the soil, into the spiritual fabric of the land. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield. It was a mass grave. Decades later, the U.S. military would build on that grave. Camp Schwab was established on the northeastern coast, beautiful, quiet, and strategically positioned. But no one thought to ask what lay beneath. No one considered that the laughter of children echoing through the mess hall late at night might not be coming from the living. Reed would later speak with a retired Japanese school teacher from the nearby town of Henoko. The man was in his 80s, but his memory was razor sharp. There were caves, he said, natural shelters. Hundreds of people hid in them when the bombs came. Some were safe, others collapsed. Others were sealed shut intentionally. Reed asked what he meant. The old man hesitated, then looked away. They were told it was more honorable to die than to be captured. Sometimes our own soldiers threw grenades into the caves to protect the women. Reed couldn't sleep for days after that. What if the girl he saw wasn't just a ghost? What if she was a child trapped in a moment of terror, looped in time, appearing not to haunt, but to beg for remembrance? What if the woman seen drifting outside the barracks wasn't some urban legend, but a mother still searching for her child beneath the mud? What if every cold draft, every flicker of electricity, every echo in the stairwell was Okinawa crying out for someone to remember? The deeper he dug, the more he began to understand that this wasn't just a haunting. It was a confrontation with history, with guilt, with the moral weight of what it means to occupy land soaked in the pain of others. For many Americans, Okinawa is just another post, a dot on a map, a tropical assignment. But for the Okinawans, it is a wound that never closed. Many still remember what their grandparents endured, and many resent the fact that foreign boots still walk over unmarked graves. There are places around Camp Schwab where locals refuse to go. Forest trails that are never walked. Caves that remain sealed. When Marines explore off base, they sometimes return changed. Quiet. Pale. One man, an athletic, no-nonsense corporal, wandered into a jungle clearing one evening and came back soaked in sweat, shaking, unable to speak. He refused to ever say what he saw. He transferred out a month later. You see, fear isn't always about horror. Sometimes fear is the body's way of telling you that you've crossed a line, that you've stepped into sacred ground without permission, that something happened here and it doesn't want to be forgotten. That's what Camp Schwab became for Reed, not a haunted base, but a living memorial. One without plaques, one without ceremonies, one buried beneath routine and protocol. And the ghosts, they weren't monsters. They were reminders. Reminders that some histories are not dead. They walk, they wait, they whisper. Reed once spoke with a chaplain stationed on base. The man had a master's in theology and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was respected, rational, and deeply spiritual. Reed asked him plainly, "Do you believe this place is haunted?" The chaplain paused for a long time. "I don't think it's haunted," he finally said. "I think it's grieving." That was the moment it all made sense. These weren't ghost stories. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a land that had seen too much and been asked to stay silent for too long. Symptoms of collective trauma passed from generation to generation, etched into stone, soaked into the air. And maybe symptoms of our own failure to listen. Because sometimes the dead don't want to scare you. They want you to understand. They want to be remembered. Reed never looked at Camp Schwab the same way again. The quiet mornings, the misty hills, the way shadows stretched longer than they should have. It all felt different now, more sacred, more fragile. He started walking the perimeter alone in the early evenings, not out of duty, but out of reverence. He'd stop by the fence where he'd seen the little girl and whisper, "I haven't forgotten you." And whether or not she heard, the air always grew still, as if something or someone was listening. Because in the end, the scariest thing about Camp Schwab isn't the ghosts. It's the possibility that we've ignored them, that we've paved over pain with pavement, that we've saluted on ground that cries out in silence, that we've looked into the jungle and refused to see the eyes looking back. This isn't just a haunting, it's a reckoning. And if we dare to listen, truly listen, maybe the dead will finally rest. By the time Sergeant Thomas Reed completed his rotation, he no longer viewed Camp Schwab as a base. Not really. Yes, it had guard towers and supply trucks. Yes, there were chow halls and rifle ranges, formations and salutes. But beneath all that, beneath the polished boots, the metal doors, and the morning bugle lay something else. Something far older. Something much heavier. A graveyard. Not in the traditional sense. There were no white crosses here, no marble slabs bearing names or dates, no grieving families laying wreaths beside the fallen. But make no mistake, Camp Schwab was built on the bones of the dead, and somehow the land never let you forget it. To the casual observer, Camp Schwab was just another overseas military post. Perched on the northeastern coastline of Okinawa, it offered a strategic foothold for the United States part of the Pacific Shield. The base operated like any other regimented, efficient, full of the daily rhythm of military life. But if you stayed there long enough, you started to feel the rhythm wasn't quite right. There was a dissonance to the air, like two realities playing side by side, the present and something beneath it. Something muffled but persistent, like a melody stuck behind a wall. Reed had sensed it early on back when he'd first seen the little girl at the edge of the ramp. But he didn't fully understand what it was until he stood at the northern fence line one gray afternoon, eyes scanning the tree line, heart heavy with something he couldn't name. The fog had rolled in from the sea, and the jungle looked different, older, almost sad. He turned to the private standing next to him and said, "You feel that?" The private nodded slowly. "Like we're not supposed to be here." That feeling, that quiet, creeping reverence began to shape how Reed moved through the base. He started avoiding certain spots, the stairwell near Barracks 4 that always smelled faintly of wet earth, even on dry days. The supply room that flickered every time someone spoke Japanese nearby. The old maintenance building where everyone's watch seemed to stop at 3:33 a.m. Even the locals stayed away. The fishermen of Henoko, the town neighboring Schwab, avoided the shoreline directly adjacent to the base. Elders said the tide pulled differently there, that it carried voices, that if you stood on the rocks too long, you'd hear someone call your name from under the waves. They called it the crying sea. But what chilled Reed most wasn't just the stories, it was how the dead seemed to linger in the details. A lone shoe buried in the dirt, unearthed during a construction dig too small to belong to any Marine. A cave entrance sealed with steel, surrounded by grass that never grew straight. A photograph from the 1960s showing Japanese children playing near the ramp known, of whom ever seemed to grow up. One corporal on night duty swore he saw a child sitting on the flagpole base just before dawn, barefoot, knees to her chest, watching the stars. She didn't move. She didn't blink. When he looked again, she was gone. He never returned to that post. Marines are taught not to fear death. They're taught to face it, challenge it, sometimes even laugh at it. But what they're not taught, what no field manual prepares them for, is what happens when death isn't finished, when it lingers, when it speaks through silence. At Camp Schwab it did, and the land it seemed was trying to tell its story. Reed began researching the specific ground where Schwab now stood. What he learned sent shivers down his spine. The area was once home to a cluster of farming villages during World War II. In the final weeks of the Battle of Okinawa, those villages were bombarded, some by mistake, others by design. Survivors fled into the jungle. Many never returned. Bodies were left unburied. Entire families were vaporized where they stood. When the U.S. military arrived to build a base, bulldozers carved through the earth, often without surveying what lay beneath. One construction foreman in the 1960s later confessed anonymously that his crew uncovered bones too small to be soldiers. He was told to keep working. They paved the access road over them. That road still exists today. Marines jog on it every morning. Convoys rumble across it every night. And beneath the asphalt, history lies crushed and silent. No memorial, no marker. Just ghosts pressed into the foundation, ignored by time. But not forgotten. Because now and then the land pushes back. Lights flicker in the armory when no one is there. The flag refuses to raise on windless mornings. An entire barracks wing reports vivid dreams of drowning the same night. A staff sergeant walks into a storage unit and emerges with scratches on his neck, unable to explain how they got there. Reed started calling these moments reminders. Not hauntings, not attacks, just reminders. That this wasn't just a base, it was borrowed ground. The Japanese spiritual worldview is built on the belief that places hold energy, that trauma imprints on the world around it. In Okinawa, this belief isn't superstition, it's history, it's blood memory. And many Okinawans believe the spirits of the dead linger wherever they've been forgotten. One Okinawan priest, when asked by a Marine what to do about the strange activity, said only this: bow your head. Say you're sorry, and mean it. There was a particular banyan tree near the mess hall, tall, gnarled, ancient. Marines avoided it instinctively, though no one said why. One day Reed saw a young corporal throw a rock at it, laughing. That night the corporal slipped in the shower and broke his collarbone. Coincidence, maybe. But when he returned weeks later, he apologized to the tree, quietly, alone, and nothing else happened. Reed came to believe Camp Schwab wasn't haunted in the way horror movies suggest. It was sacred, but sacred in a wounded way, like a church built on a battlefield, a place that demanded respect, not fear, understanding, not denial, and most of all, remembrance. He began leaving small offerings on his walks: a coin, a folded crane, a whispered prayer. Other Marines started doing the same. Quiet gestures, out of view, out of protocol, but deeply human. A base that had once been defined by routines and weapons began to take on a second life, one of humility, reflection, even reverence. Because once you understand that you're walking through a graveyard without stones, you can never unsee it. Camp Schwab changed Thomas Reed, not because he saw a ghost, but because he finally understood what the ghost was trying to say. It said we were here. It said we mattered. It said don't let silence be the only memory we leave behind. Reed, now long retired, still wears his Marine ring. He still attends reunions, still stands when the flag is raised. But when he speaks about his service, he always tells one story. Not about a firefight, not about medals, but about a girl in the rain. A barefoot girl who stood on the edge of a fence and reminded him, and all of us, that some histories refuse to stay buried. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is remember. Not every ghost wants to scare you. Some just want you to remember. That was the final truth Sergeant Thomas Reed came to understand after everything he'd seen, heard, and felt during his time at Camp Schwab. It wasn't about the jump scares. It wasn't about flickering lights or the girl at the fence. It wasn't even about fear. It was about memory and the terrible, aching cost of forgetting. In the final weeks of his deployment, Reed began to walk the perimeter of the base every evening at dusk. Not out of duty, but out of respect. The jungle mist would roll in just after sunset, curling low across the grass, like breath from a sleeping giant. The sounds of laughter from the chow hall would fade. The rhythmic thump of boots on gravel would quiet, and the bass would slip into its other self, its older self, the one that remembered the war. He passed familiar places, the maintenance ramp, where he'd first seen the barefoot girl, the armory where radios still clicked on in the middle of the night, the stairwell near Barracks 4 where no one liked to linger, and the flagpole where shadows sometimes stretched the wrong way. Each of these places had become markers not just of military life, but of something deeper, something unresolved. Because the more Reed had learned about Okinawa's past, the more he realized this was not simply haunted ground. It was unfinished business. Lives cut short, stories untold, grief unspoken. The Marines had come here to serve a mission, but what they had stumbled into was a reckoning. The war never really left Okinawa. The uniforms changed. The weapons evolved. The language shifted from Japanese to English, but the energy of the island remained the same. Heavy, watchful, burdened, in every building, every hallway, every rustling tree, and the ghosts they weren't trying to haunt anyone. They were trying to be heard. One night just before his final week on island, Reed had a dream. He was standing in a rice field, not modern, old pre-war. The sky above him was gray heavy with clouds. In front of him stood a line of children, barefoot, faces blank. Behind them, women, mothers, grandmothers, all silent. Then came a sound behind him, boots. American boots, dozens, marching. And then he heard a voice, not angry, not accusatory, just tired. We never got to say goodbye. He woke with tears on his face. That day, Reed skipped chow and walked to the jungle behind the motor pool. He found a quiet clearing beneath a gnarled tree and sat down. No notebook, no rifle, just silence. And there beneath the canopy, surrounded by vines and the hum of unseen insects, he spoke out loud, I don't know your names. I don't know where your bodies lie. But I see you, I hear you, and I'm sorry. The jungle didn't answer, but the wind shifted, the leaves stilled, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like peace. Reed wasn't the only one who felt this. In his final week, he began collecting stories from other Marines. Not official debriefs, just late-night conversations, coffee-fueled confessions, letters never sent home. Each man had something, a shadow, a whisper, a dream, a presence they couldn't explain. And almost all of them ended their story the same way. I don't think it wanted to hurt me. I think it just didn't want to be forgotten. One corporal left an offering of cherry blossoms near the old cave trail. Another carried a rosary through his whole deployment, though he'd never been religious. A lieutenant had a recurring nightmare of a mother searching for her child. He started volunteering at the base school afterward. Even the toughest, most hardened Marines, the kind who joked about everything, grew quiet when you mentioned the girl in the rain. Because deep down they knew this wasn't superstition. It was memory. And memory has weight. So many of the dead from the Battle of Okinawa were never buried. They were blown apart by shelling, crushed in collapsed caves, left to rot in fields, burned, lost, forgotten. Their families never found closure. Their stories never made it into textbooks. And when Camp Schwab was built, no one asked the land's permission. They just paved and posted guards and carried on. But the land remembered, and the dead remained. Sometimes remembrance looks like a monument, but sometimes it looks like a Marine standing alone in the rain whispering, sorry into the wind. When Reed left Okinawa, he didn't take souvenirs. No local carvings, no t-shirts, just one thing, a small stone he found beneath the banyan tree outside Barracks 3. It was round, smooth, pale gray. But when held in the light, faint red streaks ran through it almost like veins. He kept it in his pocket the entire flight home. And every time he touches it, now he remembers. Not just the base, but the girl, the voice in the dream, the feeling that he had stood in the middle of history's open wound and finally heard it speak. Now retired Reed tells his story when asked. Not for attention, not for fear, but because some truths demand to be carried. He tells other veterans, you'll feel it if you go. Don't ignore it. He tells young Marines, walk with respect. You're not the first to bleed on that land. He tells anyone who listens, this isn't just about ghosts. This is about grief, about the people war forgot, and how they refuse to stay silent. Because in the end, Camp Schwab is not just a place. It's a message, etched in fog, written in rust, spoken by the breath of those who never left. And if you ever find yourself walking its halls late at night and you hear a sound you can't explain, a laugh, a cry, a whisper, don't run, listen. Because the dead are not here to haunt you. They're here to remind you that they were real, that they mattered. And that war doesn't end when the last bullet is fired. Sometimes it echoes forever.